Teachers as Active Agents in Recontextualising Pedagogic Spaces examines the role of teachers in recontextualising pedagogic spaces in vocational education and training. The paper commences with a brief consideration of the pedagogic spaces of flexible delivery, flexible learning, online learning, e-learning and blended learning as defined in national VET policy in Australia. Drawing on the works of others, it's observed that the change management approach adopted in the implementation of these pedagogic spaces has largely been predicated on the idea of rational actor theory. Whilst it is recognised that the idea of pedagogic space is a contested idea, the broad definition adopted in this paper is that pedagogic space involves the sites in which teaching and learning occurs. There are two broad approaches to the idea of pedagogic space in the literature. The first adopts a functional perspective and gives primary consideration to the design features of pedagogic spaces. These include physical, technological, procedural and instructional design. The second major approach adopts a symbolic perspective. Here, the primary concern is for the values and assumptions that are embedded in the tools and artefacts that go to make up the pedagogic space. In this case, meaning is brought to pedagogic space through the social, cultural and political forces that are historically constructed, whilst acknowledging the benefits that a functional approach to pedagogic space can bring to the applied design of such spaces. The current paper adopts a primarily symbolic position in viewing pedagogic spaces as socially and culturally constructed that become a site of struggle for control. The pedagogic spaces discussed in this paper are representative of the institution of VET education that supports a particular moral disposition, motivation and aspiration, embedded in particular performance and practices where curriculum reform emerges out of a struggle between groups to make their bias and focus state policy and practice. The pedagogic space of vocational education and training in Australia until the late 1980s can be described as a conventional face-to-face approach with a distinct yet important distance education arm. The primary purposes of this pedagogic space were a mix of liberal and work education. The space was inhabited by students and teachers. Curriculum was locally developed and typically arranged around knowledge areas rather than work-related areas. Whilst these curricula may have been developed in consultation with local industry, they were ultimately developed by teachers. Whilst curriculum may have adopted behaviourist principles, the emphasis was primarily on input rather than outcome. From 1987, a national approach to vocational education and training emerged in a series of reforms known as the National Training Reform Agenda. A central part of this reform was the promotion of flexible delivery. Here we see a shift in emphasis towards outcomes related to workplace education. The language of student was changed to learner, the language of teacher to teacher facilitator. Industry adopted a privileged position in driving the outcomes of the vocational sector. There was a promotion of the workplace as a learning site. Competency-based training became the nationally legitimised approach to curriculum. Initially, national competency standards were developed by industry and endorsed by the National Training Board. These standards were then developed into an outcomes-based curriculum in a modular format against which teachers assessed learners' abilities. There was also substantial central support for the development of print-based learning materials. Between 1992 and 1996, the term flexible delivery was replaced by the term flexible learning. Three characteristics of flexible learning are different from that of flexible delivery. Firstly, the language of learner was replaced by the language of the client. Secondly, the manifestation of competency-based training was to change with the emergence of what has become known as training packages. Where national competency standards had previously been translated into curriculum against which learners were assessed, this new version of competency-based training required assessment directly against the workplace-based national competency standards, removing any notion of what educationalists would identify as curriculum. The training package arrangements further shifted the central focus of VET away from the language of education to the language of the workplace. The third change to occur was a recognition of the potential of online technologies to promote the outcomes desired. A revised definition published in 1996 retained the idea of flexibility in the time, place and pace of learning based on the skill needs and delivery requirements of clients, not the interests of trainers or providers. It changes the role of the trainer from a source of knowledge to a manager of learning and facilitator. The language of online learning, in representing the legitimised pedagogic space in vocational education and training, emerged in the year 2000. This representation of the pedagogic space of VET was to further reinforce the potential of network technologies in supporting desirable outcomes. The language of online learning was rapidly replaced with the language of e-learning. This was an acknowledgement that technology-based learning could incorporate both networked and non-networked technologies. Flexible learning became an umbrella term that included e-learning. Online learning was a subset of e-learning. More recently, we have seen the emergence of the language of blended learning in some policy documents. Whilst not reducing on e-learning technologies, the jargon of blended learning would seem to be an acknowledgement of the value of classroom-based learning in the vocational education and training pedagogic space. In considering the institutional redesign of the emerging VET sector in 1998, Seddon and Angus assert that contemporary reformist governments have taken up promise of institutional redesign informed by rational actor theory. If preferred behavioural outcomes can be defined, the contextual changes which produce these outcomes can be sought. The limitations of this approach are the assumptions that all action is based on self-interest rather than more complex motivations, that the importance of socio-cultural heritage is ignored, and that all behaviour is seen as predictable rather than differentiated with the possibility of unintended consequences. Rational actor theory discounts the importance of human agency. Alternatively, this paper supports the position that institutional redesign is a complex process that is characterised by contestation and struggle for control over the legitimisation of institutional norms. Social and political theories are required in understanding institutional life and the effects of institutional reforms. It's here that Bernstein's work, particularly his notion of recontextualisation, provides a way to examine the issues of power and control and the contest for legitimisation that occurs in institutions. Recontextualisation rules regulate the formation of specific pedagogic discourse to construct the thinkable, official knowledge and the what and how of pedagogic discourse. Recontextualisation is influenced by two fields. Through the official recontextualising field, the state and its delegates operate at a generative level to legitimise official pedagogic discourse. This becomes represented in pedagogic spaces. This undergoes further recontextualisation through the pedagogic recontextualising field when policy is interpreted and implemented by those who are directly involved in teaching. The model presented here proposes that teachers' pedagogic influences operate against a background of official influences which legitimise a pedagogic pool from which specific instructional practices are drawn. The level of teacher autonomy is dependent on the balance of influence of the official and teacher fields. Where official influences overwhelm teacher influences through agencies such as restrictive curriculum, standardised testing and the use of centrally developed resources, there is limited autonomy. One could argue that pedagogic space of vocational education and training has been characterised by these restrictive influences. In this case, the teacher experiences tight restriction in their discretion in shaping the specific instructional practices that are implemented. Where official influences do not overwhelm teacher influences, there is a greater level of autonomy and choice of specific instructional practices which may be either consistent with or inconsistent with the expected outcomes of the official policy. One can argue that in the vocational sector that many teachers have adopted a position of recontextualising the officially legitimised pedagogic space to reflect more closely their values and beliefs about what constitutes good teaching. In the absence of overwhelming influences, teachers are active agents in shaping of teaching and learning interactions that emerge. That is, teachers' practice cannot be entirely predicted through rational, logical means. In summary, this paper has shown that policy reforms in VET in Australia since the late 1980s developed with the specific intention of reforming the official pedagogic discourse and associated pedagogic spaces that have been described, a model that represents the dynamics that shape teachers' practice when they integrate online technology is used as a basis to portray the transitions from one pedagogic space to another. This model depicts teachers as active agents. It supports those who challenge rational act theory as an approach that is likely to result in predictable changes in teachers' practice in the face of policy reform.